The year is 1945. The war is over. After the devastation, the world should finally have been able to breathe a sigh of relief. But that breath was cut short by an icy chill. On one side, the Soviet Union, a giant socialist power. On the other, the United States, the leader of the capitalist world. They were not enemies, but they could never be friends. And this was the beginning of the Cold War. A war not of bullets, but of ideas. Yet real enough to upend the lives of millions, even those far from the front lines. In 1945, when World War II came to an end, the world hoped for peace. However, the silence that peace brought quickly gave way to distrust and ideological division. The victors of the war, the United States and the Soviet Union, soon began to view each other with suspicion. In February 1945, at the Yalta Conference, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin sat at the same table, but while this table appeared to secure peace, behind the scenes, the foundations of a new war were being laid. Stalin began expanding Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, supporting communist regimes in countries like Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria. The West watched these moves with growing concern. It was during this period that Winston Churchill uttered his now famous words, "An Iron Curtain is descending across Eastern Europe." This Iron Curtain was not just a metaphor, but a clear expression that Europe was now divided in two. Germany was split into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. However, when Berlin, the heart of Germany, was also divided into 4, the ideological battle ignited right at the center. In 1948, Stalin attempted to seize West Berlin by blocking all land and rail routes. Electricity was cut off, and food and essential supplies were prevented from entering. But the West did not give in. Led by the United States, the Berlin Airlift began, and for 11 months straight, thousands of flights delivered tons of aid to the city every day. This event marked the first major tension of the Cold War. No shots were fired, but the psychological aspect of the conflict was strongly felt. The West and the East were now separated not only by borders but also by ideas and systems. Capitalism faced socialism, democracy stood against one-party rule. The streets of Berlin were no longer just part of a city, they had become the symbol of two worlds. And the world now knew, the guns may have fallen silent, but a new war had begun. Its name was the Cold War. The true face of the Cold War emerged in the 1950s: fear, distrust, and a deadly race. The world was divided into 2 camps, and now it wasn't just ideologies preparing for battle, armies were as well. When NATO was founded in 1949 under US leadership, the Soviets saw it as a direct threat. The response was swift. In 1955, the Warsaw Pact was established. These 2 military blocs turned the world map into a giant chessboard, except the pieces were nuclear missiles. At the end of World War II, the United States had demonstrated its power to the world by dropping atomic bombs on Japan. The Soviets refused to accept this imbalance of power, and in 1949, they tested their own atomic bomb. Then came thermonuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and warheads launched from submarines. Both sides had reached the capacity to annihilate each other, a situation known as mutually assured destruction, MAD. If one side pressed the button, the other would too, and the world would cease to exist. This era of fear directly impacted daily life. In the US, civil defense drills became common. Children at schools were taught duck and cover, nuclear bomb safety exercises, while families dug fallout shelters in their backyards. The same panic gripped the Soviet Union. Between 1950 and 1953, the Korean War broke out. North Korea, backed by the Soviets, attacked the South. United Nations forces led by the US defended South Korea. When the war ended, the borders remained unchanged, but the message was clear: the Cold War could turn into a hot war at any time. The height of this tension came in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets had secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, right on America's doorstep. When US intelligence discovered them, the world held its breath for nearly a week. The diplomatic chess match between President Kennedy and Soviet leader Khrushchev brought humanity to the brink of the most dangerous moment in history. Millions lived on the edge of nuclear war. At the last moment, both leaders stepped back, and the crisis was resolved. But by then, the world understood one thing very clearly: a single miscalculation in the Cold War could bring about the end. Everyone was on edge. War didn't break out, but true peace never came. In 1957, one morning, when people looked up at the sky, there was something more than just stars: the Soviet Union's Sputnik 1 satellite. For the first time in human history, an artificial satellite was orbiting the Earth. This small metal sphere was not just a scientific achievement, it was also a warning bell for America. The Cold War would now continue not only on land, at sea, or with nuclear weapons, but also in space. The Soviets had proven to the entire world that they had taken the lead in the space race. Then came 1961 and Yuri Gagarin, the first human in history to travel into space. The Soviet successes shook the United States deeply. The issue was no longer just science, it was a battle of prestige and ideology. America knew it could not afford to fall behind. In 1961, President Kennedy made a historic declaration: "Before this decade is out, we will send an American to the moon." This promise marked the beginning of a massive scientific and economic mobilization. NASA was no longer just a scientific institution, it had become a tool of propaganda. Every satellite, every rocket, every step was not only an engineering feat but also a symbol of the West's claim to freedom. The Soviets and the Americans had now turned technology into a weapon. Satellites placed in space became eyes watching the world. Both sides were monitoring, listening, and analyzing each other. Every step taken in space heightened the tension on Earth. And then, in 1969, the US fulfilled its promise. The Apollo 11 mission was successfully completed, and when Neil Armstrong took his first step on the moon, the world held its breath. That step was small for mankind, but a giant blow for the Cold War. America had seized the upper hand in this race. However, this victory did not end the war, because this was not an ending, but merely a new front. Space had now become not a realm of hope, but one of surveillance and dominance. Even the sky was no longer neutral. The darkest phase of the Cold War was not the weapons or the steps taken in space, but the invisible war itself: intelligence, espionage, coups, and covert operations. From the 1950s to the 1980s, governments in dozens of countries around the world were overthrown and replaced, but more often than not, the real power behind the scenes was either the United States or the Soviet Union. The CIA and the KGB were not merely intelligence-gathering agencies, they had become invisible armies. Spies changed identities in cities, embassies turned into bases for agents, and double agents danced on the thin line between life and death. A microfilm hidden inside a briefcase in East Berlin, a map slipped into the pocket of a villager in Vietnam, or an order whispered into the ear of a soldier in Latin America, these were the quiet yet devastating strikes of the war. In 1953, in Iran, the democratically elected Prime Minister Mossadegh was overthrown in a CIA-backed coup. Why? Because the West did not want to lose control of Iranian oil. In 1973, in Chile, Socialist President Allende was killed in an American-backed coup led by Pinochet. Why? Because communism was unacceptable in Washington's own backyard. The Soviets, meanwhile, were far from idle. From Africa to Asia, communist uprisings were supported, weapons were sent, and training was provided. The Vietnam War was the bloodiest of these covert conflicts. Believing that communism would spread like dominoes, the US sent hundreds of thousands of troops. The result? A lost war, millions dead, and deep humiliation. By this point, the Cold War was no longer fought solely between the superpowers but had turned into proxy wars waged through their puppets. Peoples were made to fight not for their own ideologies, but for the balance of power. Politicians deceived the public with promises of freedom, but behind the scenes, there was only one real objective: to expand influence and push back the opposing side. Democracy, socialism, independence, these were often nothing more than masks. The real war was being played by unseen hands. And this game was dirty. 1979 marked a new turning point in the Cold War. The Soviet Union sent troops into neighboring Afghanistan, a move that once again shook the global balance of power. The Soviets sought to protect the communist government in Afghanistan, but the United States saw this intervention as outright aggression. In response, President Jimmy Carter boycotted the Moscow Olympics and began providing millions of dollars in covert aid to the Afghan resistance, the Mujahideen. The US wanted the Soviets to become bogged down in a quagmire, and it succeeded. Armed with the support of the CIA in Pakistan, the Mujahideen grew stronger, a support that, years later, would give rise to groups like the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Then, in 1981, Ronald Reagan became president. Reagan saw the Cold War as a struggle between good and evil. He labeled the Soviet Union the evil empire and increased America's military budget to record levels. New nuclear missiles were deployed in Europe, and military exercises were conducted near Soviet borders. But the most strategic move came in 1983 with the announcement of the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, better known as Star Wars. This program aimed to deploy laser and missile defense systems in space to destroy Soviet missiles in mid-flight. The Soviets lacked the economic capacity to counter such a project and, becoming more isolated, escalated tensions further. At the same time, signs of internal collapse began to appear within the Soviet Union. The economy was deteriorating, people were growing poorer, and technology lagged far behind the West. In 1983, the Soviets mistook a NATO exercise for an actual attack and raised the nuclear alert level. Once again, the world narrowly avoided catastrophe. During this period, the two blocs had not come this close to an all-out war in decades. The Cold War had now turned from a purely psychological battle into a deadly race in practice. But at this critical moment, a young and reform-minded leader was about to take charge of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. And his arrival would change the Cold War forever. In the mid-1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union, bringing with him two words that would change the course of the Cold War forever: glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Gorbachev knew the system had become unsustainable. The economy had collapsed, technology lagged far behind the West, and the people were quietly on the verge of revolt. The regime was crumbling not only from external pressures but from within. These reforms gave hope to millions who longed for freedom, but they also triggered a chain reaction that led to the dissolution of the Eastern Bloc. In Poland, the Solidarność movement grew, Hungary opened its borders, Czechoslovakia saw the Velvet Revolution. And then, in November 1989, the iconic structure, the Berlin Wall, was torn down by the hands of the people. The streets of East Germany filled with cries for freedom, and the path toward reunification with West Germany began. This event symbolized not only the collapse of Germany's division but also the downfall of the entire Cold War order. The Soviet Union could no longer maintain its influence. The Warsaw Pact dissolved, and former allies declared independence. The final blow came in 1991. The Baltic states announced their independence, and after the failed coup attempt of August 1991, Gorbachev lost his political power. In December of that same year, the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. 15 new states emerged, the red flag was lowered over the Kremlin, replaced by a different worldview. The world had now become unipolar, the United States declared victory, capitalism had prevailed, and the threat of nuclear war, at least for the time being, was shelved. But the marks left by the Cold War, political crises, divided societies, proxy wars, and deep-seated traumas, were still felt across the globe. This frozen conflict, which began in 1947, ended in 1991. Yet it left behind a silent catastrophe that had altered millions of lives, an invisible struggle that had shaped the spirit of an era. And the world would never be the same again. If you enjoyed our video, don't forget to click the like button and subscribe to our channel to support us. You can turn on notifications to stay updated on our new content. Thank you for watching.